All right. So let me move my things here. All right. So today what I'm going to do is give some brief cliff notes about what's covered in my book that just came out in October. It's called Bet the Farm, the Dollars and Cents of Raising Food, Growing Food in America. And I'm going to talk for maybe 15 minutes, and then I'd like to open it up to questions and have you share a little bit as well with me. So this is me. I'm Beth Hoffman. I am a journalist. I've covered food and agriculture for about 25 years as a freelance journalist, doing both print and radio. I was raised outside of New York City and I lived around the country, but I was living in Berkeley, California when I met my husband, John. And it's all talked about in the book. I'm not going to go into this here, but we moved to Iowa. We'll skip forward. We moved to Iowa about 3 years ago now. And now I am an Iowa farmer. We raise grass-finished beef, meat, goats, hay, forage foods like mushrooms. And there is our dog Snooks, who helps us with cattle. Okay, so this is a photo of our farm, and it's very green and lush trees in this area of Iowa. But the backstory of this farm and this land is that in 1842, the Meskwaki tribe was here in this region, and they signed a treaty with the US government that said that they would leave the area within 3 years. They were given 3 years to leave. But it's a very, very interesting story. I would encourage everyone who is not familiar with it to find out more, because the Meskwaki did not leave. Some of them stayed and hid out actually in Iowa. And in 1856, they petitioned the government of Iowa, was then a state, and bought land. So they are private property owners in Iowa, which is a unique situation for a tribe. They now own something like 8,000 acres. And I'll just remind people who are joining us, make sure you're muting yourself, because we're going to be able to unmute to ask questions. All right, so my husband John's great-great-grandfather came to Iowa in 1851. And after he was working, surveying for the railroads. That same year, 1851, the Dakota Land Cession Treaties were finalized in Iowa. The US government promised to pay over $3 million for the land, which it didn't do. And also in 1851, when James Shipp, was his name, James Shipp Hoagland, came to Iowa, there was a newly enacted exclusionary law which barred blacks, free blacks and mulattoes, this was the language in the law, from settling in the state. And if they did, they needed to leave within 3 days or be arrested. So that's the land that we farm on. And in this picture, we garden on. And I want to make the point, and I did in the book, that we are able to do this because John's family was able to purchase the land at that time. They were white settlers that came in and were able to do that because they were white. And they also were supported over the years by the USDA and banks, support that many farmers of colors did not receive in the same time period over these generations. So as I talk about in the book, Bet the Farm, this is what I mean by privilege, coming into farming with privilege. And somebody might have not muted themselves. So this is what I mean about farming, coming into farming with privilege. We had access to land, this family land, and the family wealth that had been built over generations. So the book does what I did with you, and we can have a conversation a little bit about communicating about our farms and how do we tell people about the larger picture. The book tries to do what I just did with you. It uses our experience and our personal story of the family and us moving to Iowa to talk about these bigger issues in agriculture. And in addition to questions of privilege and access to land, which of course is worthy of entire talks, and we're lucky to have some going on at this conference. I also talk about things like land transition in the book, and I use the sort of nitty gritty about our financial situation to talk about the problems, the difficulty of farmers making money at farming. And I really, really believe, and the book is really dedicated to the idea that if we as farmers and the public don't understand the realities of farming and the agriculture system in general, we can't really make lasting changes in the system. We won't match the solutions with the actual problems if we don't understand how it works. So we can't make it more sustainable if we don't address why people do what they do in farming. All right, so I want to tell you another story as well. And this is a story about, it's a similar story to that many of you will know this story in your own families and in your own lives in different ways. So it's a story of when John's dad, Leroy, put up this silo that is pictured here in the mid 1970s. He did so to feed out and fatten cattle with chopped hay and corn. And he was an early adopter. So he was one of the first people to put up this silo. And he could feed many more cattle than he could before. And he built it with a $14,000 loan, which is equivalent to maybe $80,000 today, that he got from the local bank, which again, he was able to get loans as a white male farmer in the area. He built this silo, and there's a small lot next to it. It's a little hard to see there, in which to fatten the cattle. So it worked out really pretty well for him, actually. So well that by the 1980s, by the early 1980s, he decided to buy also 35 calves to add to the 40 that he was already raising. So he borrowed more money. But by this time in the early 80s, many more of these silos were put up. And therefore, there were many, many more cows that were being raised here. And by the time that Leroy's calves were grown, there was a glut of cattle on the market. And the price of beef plummeted. And in an attempt to pay off his debt, he had to sell all 75 calves. So the amount that he made from the sale of those 75 calves didn't actually cover his loan that he had taken out to purchase the additional ones. So this is one of the stories that I tell to talk about this, one of the biggest myths in farming. There's two that I'll talk about like at rapid speed here. There's a lot more details in the book, but the first one is the bigger is better myth, which today looks something like this. It's not quite a simple silo anymore, although to give credit, my neighbors are not using this kind of machinery. They use much smaller combines, but this bigger is better myth tells us as farmers, we got to get bigger, we got to get new equipment, we need better seeds, we need more land. And that, if we do all that, then at some point we're going to get profitable. And the idea behind it is that all of this is going to increase our yields, which is going to make us more money, and that we all need to compete with each other for higher yields. So you see a lot of the language that's in like advertising, it's all this kind of competitive, almost warlike kind of language about, you know, defeat the competition. And who's the competition? Our neighbors, right? The problems with this is that while it does work out initially very often for early adopters like Leroy was with his silo, it also always leads to overproduction and oversupply. And if you look at the history of like corn and corn prices and things, it always leads to this oversupply. The price goes up and then boom, it goes crashing down, and it stays there for a while until it goes back up and comes crashing down again. And it also traps farmers in a cycle of debt. And as John's mom told me, she felt like she was on a hamster wheel that they just couldn't get off. For that silo that they purchased in the 80s, they were paying that off until they were in their 70s. So it was until like in the 2000s when they paid that off. The other myth I wanted to rapidly talk about here is what I call the agrarian myth. Lots of people call the agrarian myth, which is one that gets really tricky, especially for those of us in sustainable agriculture, because this is a myth that's full of these big ideals that we're trying to, well, not only we are seeing farming as like a simple life, and you get your hands in the dirt and you see all these very romantic, beautiful videos of homesteaders, but it's also these like ideals of, we're feeding, this is pasture raising animals. These are our cows actually, but you're trying to nourish the community. You're trying to steward the land. This is a huge one, right? And a lot of people end up saying things like, well, money's not the point. It's about the environment. It's about providing healthy, fresh food for people. And so money's not the point. And what researchers, I'm not just making this up, but researchers have found what this does is leads to people exploiting their own labor, the labor of farm workers often, in working too hard and not taking care of yourself, and selling your food for way too low. So a lot of times it doesn't cover the cost of production and labor, because you don't want to make the food just for the affluent, fancy people. You want to have food be cheap enough that everyone's going to buy it at your own cost. And this leads to burnout. So as you are well aware, I'm sure many of you, that it's just not sustainable to do for a long time, work 100-hour work weeks and make no money at it. It leads to people leaving the profession. So instead of these myths, I talk about in the book some new narratives that I think that would really recast things for us all, and help us try and think about how to talk about farming differently and do farming differently. The first part of that new narrative is on the personal level. Self-care and your own sanity really has to be as high of a priority as stewarding the land. If we're not taking care of ourselves, we can't really take care of others. At the farm level, instead of trying to do it all alone, being this rugged individualism of the agrarian myth, it includes asking for help, including others. And on our farm, we're trying to bring in a lot of other people to run their own enterprises. Regionally, it's about farms, instead of in the bigger and better myth, where we're all in competition with each other, there's possibilities for cooperation amongst farms, and for farmers to actually take some of the power back that's been lost in the marketplace, and banding together to do things like limit supply or build marketing plans together. And nationally, instead of, again, having these myths of feeding the world and using policy to promote bigger is better, we can be taking into account the long-term viability of farms over generations of all different kinds, not just farm families that look like ours, and allow those who work in offices in the NRCS office and the FSA office to actually spend time with people figuring out how to do things better. Oop. All right, so this is the book. And that's a lot. That's something like a very quick excerpt of what I cover in the book. And I want to save time for discussion. I can put this back up at the end if you want, but this is where you could get it. You could also contact me. I'm really interested in like running book clubs in particular about the book with farmers to kind of hear feedback and see what's resonating and what is not with people. So, all right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And what I'd like to do is have a conversation here, and the rules of the road here are going to be that you can speak. I think maybe that, I don't know if the hand raising thing, we can try that, but there's no, we'll just have people talk and you'll just be making space for each other. But I'd really love for people to keep their comments, questions to like the 30 seconds to a minute thing. We don't have time for everyone to tell long stories, but I think this way we could get a lot more interactivity. So you can just unmute yourself, and if it gets crazy, we'll do the hand thing.
Beth, this is Denise O'Brien over across the state from you, and I'm so glad you're here. And we've been tweeting back and forth, but it's interesting. Thank you for what you are doing. And I think what I got from your book so far is your explanation of the government programs and things. I think it's a very concise way, although it's been criticized by the other person who's been tweeting with us, of people understanding how the government works and how the farmers got on the treadmill of what they can't get off. And I appreciate that part.
Thank you. Yeah, so I talk in the book about the difficulties with subsidies and just how convoluted it is. The fact that the farm bill comes up every 5 years and keeps kind of putting on band-aids and reconfiguring programs and bringing them this way and that way. And even farmers don't really understand. In our FSA office, for example, the routine is you walk in the door, they've filled out the forms for you already. And you just say, you pick, from the ARC program or the PLC program for your corn and soybean subsidy. And you basically don't have any idea what that really means. And you just go like, well, what do they say I should do? And they say, well, for soybeans, you should do this and you should do that. Okay, fine. And you sign. And that is really the process. Is nobody really gets it. And it's not really clear why things are the way they are. That said, it's also kind of supposed to be that you're not getting paid for planting corn. You don't get paid if you plant, 500 acres of corn. You do not get paid for 500 acres of planting corn. You are supposed to be able to then plant what makes sense in the marketplace, which is not happening because one of my arguments is that there's not support there at that office to tell you what else you could do and what other programs might be available. So it's a bit of a personnel problem in addition to the policy problem. And it's not for lack of not trying and not being nice and everybody is trying. There's just too much information and too many check boxes to fill out and not enough time.
Beth, I'm going to jump in right here. Denise tweeted about your book and I answered it. I love it. I am a beginner farmer myself and I'm a banker, and everything you put in that book is what we talk about in our department, from like beginner farmers not understanding the financial part of it, the FSA programs, the subsidies, and you do it without judgment to conventional farmers necessarily, because it really is a treadmill. I'm sitting here in a truck ready to go into a combine over there, and it's you're kind of stuck in it. You know, how are you supposed to get out of it? And anyone who hasn't read this book, read this book. It's very practical. It's very much, you know, everybody loves their farms and it does romanticize it, but it is a business. It needs to be run like a business, otherwise you're going to lose it. And I know that sounds callous, but this book is really good. I've already bought copies for my ag library and I'm sharing it with my coworkers and family. So it's so good. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the Women Food and Ag Network for inviting you, because that's how I found out about the books. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, I so appreciate that, Sarah. And then just to know, like, you're a banker who lends to farmers who felt like it was a good explanation. I mean, it really means a ton to me to hear that kind of comment. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of beginning farmer programs out there that are really trying to teach business skills and have people think about their farm as also as a business. But it's a really tough task for beginning farmer programs because there's so many different people doing so many different things and at different levels at the same time in the same class, that the principles that one person needs, the next person doesn't necessarily. So I think that, you know, it's something that I'd really love to work in. And if anybody has advice about how to get into the world of teaching and beginning farming, I'd really love to be involved in that. I was a professor and a teacher my whole life. And I think that the teaching elements, like using actual teaching principles in programs, is really important as well. And so I would love to be involved in that more.
I have a question.
Yes.
So I work for the NRCS, and I just finished a 3-day climate resiliency workshop as it relates to agriculture. And one thing that wasn't talked about, but was kind of on my mind throughout the training, is how economics factors into farmers not wanting to take the risk to implement these climate resiliency or conservation practices. And I was just wondering if your book goes into that at all.
Yeah, great question. And, you know, I love that there's people from the NRCS, and I'm hoping that, you know, it's never coming across that I think that anybody is doing a bad job. I don't. I really empathize with the idea of being in a bureaucracy where there's so many layers of things. So I would say that, yes, one of the things that I talk about in the book is that John, my husband, really taught me when I was thinking through a lot of this. And I would say to him, like, well, why didn't your dad ever do anything differently? And he said, because you can't ever spend a year not making income because you have all of these loans to pay off. I mean, you just can't switch gears into something new if there's any risk of losing money. And I think that farmers, especially farmers who are farming commodities that get payments, even if the payments aren't very big, and I'd like to make that clear, like most commodity farmers, somebody who has an average acreage in Iowa, which is something like 360 acres is average, you know, you can't just like not, oh, that payment is just so, it's not very big. You know, people are getting $4,000, $5,000, $7,000. It's not enough to really incentivize you per se to go into corn, but it's also not enough. It's enough that you you get that little boost to pay off your combine, to pay off the land rent or whatever. So it plays a big factor. And one of the things I talk about in the book that I believe the USDA should consider is debt moratoriums, even if they're just loan, not forgiveness entirely, but being able to postpone the payments on loans for 3 years, let's say, if you're going into organics. That would give you, and maybe it should be 5 years, because you got to get rolling too once you're started. So if you had the ability to slow down that treadmill, I think that you could get more people that could get off of it entirely.
Awesome. Thank you.
Anybody else? You just have a few minutes. I'm looking.
There's a question in the chat. Someone's wondering what some of the responses to breaking away from the agrarian myth by other farmers are.
Like what other farmers are saying to me, I guess, about that idea. I was in something, so an interesting thing called the Clubhouse. Someone invited me to be in this app, and there was a talk, and it sounded like really one of the major things that farmers are dealing with is communicating to consumers. Like, how do we tell consumers what we're really doing? And I think that even very large scale farmers, or particularly large scale farmers, are really struggle with this, because they're hidden behind some layers of the food chain where they're not visible. They're not really having communication with customers that they serve. So I think that it's really important, these new narratives, because for people like that, it doesn't work to just show up on YouTube or on Twitter and say, my combine's broken again, and then start. They were all very concerned about sounding like they were whining all the time. And I think that new narratives allow us all to use our story to talk about things proactively. Like, here's what's going on the farm, and this is why it's going on in the farm. Not always when it's a bad time, but like, here, I'm doing this. This is why I'm doing this. This is the history of what I'm doing. That it would give people a lot more, just a lot more options for actually communicating a real and authentic self to consumers and to the public. Anybody else? So someone asked about the link to the book, so I'll just put that up again. There's oh, now I'm gonna have a problem. Okay. So here it is again. It's on Island Press. And so if you just go to the Island Press website and you search for me, I think the book comes up, it's a newer book of theirs, so it'll show up on their website. And if you use the discount code, you get 20% off. And again, if people would like to contact me, I will do my best to get back in touch with you. I can't make any real promises at this moment, but I tend to be good with email. So I'd love to hear if you have other comments or questions. I think it is the end of my time with you. But thank you so much for listening to this little quick, it feels very, 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 very fast, but I appreciate your time.